In this video, I'll refinish and repair this table. I found this table in a thrift store. I usually avoid furniture that's this fancy, mostly because all of the carvings and the small details can be a little tedious to strip. But this is a pretty small piece, so I figured it wouldn't be too much trouble, so I took it home. I began by removing the old finish. To do this, I used a scraper. The finish was thin, so it didn't take too much effort to remove it. On this rounded edge, I used a utility knife blade to scrape off the finish. And used sandpaper to get whatever was left. On the drawer front, I used a smaller scraper that fit in there better. There was a large chip in the veneer on the front of the drawer. The veneer on the drawer front is some highly figured walnut, and I didn't have any veneer that would match that to patch this chipped area, so I filled it with some wood filler. And later on, I could touch up the color if needed to blend it in. As I was working on the table, I noticed that these grooves were carved a little off. You can see here how the edge is not straight. And even up at the top, they're a little off. I always like to find imperfections like this in furniture when I'm working on it. I feel like it takes a little pressure off of myself to make it perfect, because it wasn't even perfect when it left the factory. So it helps me to loosen up a little bit. The shelf on the bottom was just held in by screws, so I could remove that, and that would make it easier to work on the legs. On the legs, I used a utility knife blade to scrape off the finish. On this fancy carved section, I just lightly scraped and sanded the finish off of the raised portion, and I left it down in the deeper parts. I figured having that extra color down there would help to add some depth to it. There was some wood missing on one of the legs. Here's the spot before I removed the finish. It's a little easier to see with the finish on there. To fix this, I used some epoxy putty to rebuild that section. You just slice a piece off and then mix it together. This is called Quick Wood. There's actually two products out there called Quick Wood. They're both putty, but one's spelled with a K and one's spelled with a Q. I've used both and I don't notice any difference between the two. Once it was all mixed together, then I applied it to the repair area. And it helps to wet your fingers when you're working with this. It doesn't stick to your fingers as much and just makes it easier to shape. And I got it roughly shaped, left it a little bit oversized so that when it dried, I could come back with some sandpaper and bring it to its final shape. There was some damage to the veneer on the side. To fix this, I put a piece of paper over the area to be patched and traced the shape with a pencil. And then I taped that to a piece of veneer and cut out a patch. And I just followed the line that I traced. And then I could just glue it in and clamp it up. Once the glue dried, I cleaned it up with a utility knife blade and some sandpaper. And trimmed off the excess veneer on the bottom. The other smaller chips I decided just to fill with some wood filler. The top had a lot of little dents in it, so I wanted to try and remove as many of those as I could by steaming them out with an iron. I first wet down the surface with some water and then put a damp cloth over it and put the iron on top of the cloth. And this usually works pretty well to remove dents. After it had dried, then I sanded it to 180 grit. Then it was time to apply the stain. I used a liquid oil stain, and the color was called American Walnut. I let the stain sit a little longer on the legs than I did on the side and the top, because the sides and the top were walnut veneer, so they already had some good color in them and didn't need that much stain. But the legs were some type of a white wood. I don't know what it was exactly, but it needed more color to bring it closer to the top and the sides. So I let the stain sit on there maybe for a few minutes. So it still wasn't a long time, but a little longer than I left it on top and sides. Here's a shot of the drawer front after the stain was applied. Here's where that repair is that I made in the veneer with the wood filler. From this angle, it blends in pretty well, but if you look at it from this angle, you can just barely see some light reflecting off of the drawer right where that filler is. And that's because I didn't get a sharp enough edge on there. It's a little bit of a flattened edge, a little bit of a curve. So there's more surface area for light to reflect off of it. So when you're doing repairs like this, trying to get things blended in, it's not only about the color, but also about how the light reflects off of it. For the top coat, I chose a clear satin lacquer, and I sprayed it on. Once the lacquer had dried, I buffed it lightly with some fine steel wool and dark wax. The last step was to put the drawer pull back on. And here it is, all finished. Thanks for watching.